Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. James 3:13 through to 18, the word of the Lord.
All right. Hey, if you've been with us over the last few weeks, we've actually been in this message series in the book of James. And James is the brother of Jesus. And Jesus, of course, is the one that centers around the Christian faith. And James is actually someone who, of course, he observed Jesus and knew Jesus' life even before Jesus came on the scene in a public way. So, I mean, that's what's so startling is that even Jesus' brother James actually calls Jesus Lord. So his own brother says that Jesus is the Son of God. Like, that is just so astounding. Now, James, of course, is writing this letter, and he's writing about what does it look like for each one of us when it comes to living out our lives in the manner of what he observed according to the life of Jesus. What does it look like to have true faith? Not just some sort of flimsy faith or a faith that just talks a good game, but actually a faith that lives itself out, that is looking to follow Jesus in all of its ways. Now, to give you a snapshot of where we've been, it's really, James is actually a book that's in the broader tradition of what's called wisdom literature. In other words, wisdom literature basically means that for any one of us, you might not even be a Christian here. Nonetheless, hopefully that what you've heard over the last few weeks is you're like, yeah, I think that's true. I think it makes sense what you're saying about trials and temptations. When it comes to trials and temptations, yes, I think that how we respond to trials and temptations, that's what really forges one's character. When it comes to listening, right? Remember we talked about how James talks about being quick to listen. Can I hear you say quick to listen? Can I hear you say slow to speak? Can I hear you say slow to anger? That's right. Where's that from? It's from James, who's talking about this wisdom literature. Like, this is the manner in which we speak to one another. When it comes to our faith and our works and what we do, our deeds, how we live out our faith, we're not just talkers, but we actually live in such a manner that reflects what we say we believe. Last week, we talked about this idea that words matter greatly. How we use our words, whether we use our words for blessing other people or whether we use for cursing other people. In all of these different themes, we talked about equality, how James gives kind of this view of what does Christian equality look like, the dignity of men and women and the way that we're supposed to treat one another with respect. Now, again, in the ancient world, all of these wisdom principles, he's giving them from a Christian perspective that is so astounding and over and against the ways that the world lives. So as you imagine, the way that New Yorkers, the way that we approach life, relationships, faith, I mean, could you imagine what James, this letter is for us because it's trying to give us a vision of what does a truly wise life look like. Now, here's what James ends up saying. Look at what it says. It says, who is wise and understanding among you? Turn to your neighbor and say, who is wise and understanding among you? Dave Jennings. No, I'm just kidding. Right, who is wise and understanding among you? He says, let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. Now, here's what's so stunning to me, because here he is, he's basically saying, what is wisdom? Who is wise and understanding among you? Like, who is truly wise? Now, most of the time, whenever I think about wisdom and those who are truly wise, I think, oh, there's people that just know a lot. They're PhDs. They've got master's degrees. They're people who are at the top of their field or their profession or whatever else it might look like. And yet what's so stunning is that, notice what James says, that wisdom is actually, it's not about knowledge. It's actually about a good life and deeds. It's how someone actually embodies what wisdom is like more than knowing a whole lot of things. Now, again, in my life, wisdom and knowledge used to be tied together. Like, the more you know, that's how wise you are. And yet James is saying, see, it's not even about how much you know. It's actually about how you live. One Franciscan priest, one of the things he says is, we have a lot of elderly people. We have very few elders. Now, what does that mean? It means that despite how old one might be, how many accolades one might have, how great they might be at the top of their profession, that's not what wisdom is. Wisdom is not accumulating all this stuff or knowing a lot of things. It's actually far different than that. One of the cartoons that I used to like reading, has anyone seen a cartoon called The Far Side? Well, here it is. Here's the Far Side cartoon. I think this describes what wisdom is like, right? So if wisdom is not knowledge, but wisdom is much different than that. I love this cartoon because here the Midvale School of the Gifted, and yet here's this guy who doesn't maybe know how to live. We all know people like that. And if you don't, maybe you are that person. No, I'm just kidding. Here's what Rabbi Marvin Tokaier, look at what he says. He says, it seems that we today do not know the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Compared to a few hundred years ago, the knowledge we humans have is truly enormous. I mean, isn't that true? We have things like the internet and Google. The smartest generation continues to increase. Why? Because we have so much access to knowledge, way more than in years past. The amount continues to increase. But notice what he says. However, I feel that wisdom through life is actually regressing. I mean, isn't that true? We have a lot of knowledgeable people. We have so much access to so much information. But is wisdom increasing? Is the manner in which we live our lives, is that increasing? Wisdom is not just knowledge. It's deeper than that. And how is it deeper? Now, notice what James says. He says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility. This word humility is there. That comes from wisdom. What is so distinct about wisdom? It's not more knowledge that you've accumulated. It's not how many degrees you have. It's not what your CV looks like, how much money you have, your net worth. What wisdom looks like is actually, it comes from humility. Now, this word humility, the etymology of the word humility, it actually comes from this Latin word humilis, which basically means grounded, which comes from the word humus, which basically is the word earth or ground. Now, isn't that interesting? So in other words, what humility is I am a grounded person. I've got my feet on the ground. Now, sometimes I might think of, humility is someone who's like, I'm the worst, I'm so bad, and da-da-da-da. That's not what humility is. That's self-debasement. That's not what humility looks like. Instead of humility, though, humility is not, nor is it overestimating myself, thinking that I'm better than I am. Instead, it's this grounded perspective, having my feet on the ground. See, and what James is basically saying is that what true wisdom looks like, more than being someone who has all these accolades and knowledge and has accumulated all this stuff, is actually someone who's so grounded. They've got their feet on the ground. They're not too high and they're not too low. They are who they truly are. There's something about a humility, that a way of living and existing in the world. Now, so much of that goes against the ways of the world, goes against the ways of the city. And yet, this is the distinct marker of what true humility and wisdom look like. Now, notice what James says, though. Check this out. When he talks about how what gets us off track when it comes to wisdom, it's this. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but it is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. He uses such stark words here to illustrate. See, there's a different kind of wisdom, a way of the world that's much different than the wisdom of Jesus. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. Now, isn't that interesting? He brings up these words, envy. coveting what other people have, wanting their other things, or selfish ambition. Now, the word for selfish ambition is actually from this Greek word that Aristotle would use in this politicking way, like a politician who's cravenly trying to get over on other people to get their way in their seat of power. So when he's talking about envy and selfish ambition, now it's different. Now, how about for Christians? Are we allowed to have ambition? Of course we are. The scriptures constantly talk about stewarding your gifts, using the best of what you have, giving all of your life to something, and doing so for the glory of God, using your talents and your gifts. So the scriptures are but there's a difference between holy ambition and selfish ambition. And see, what's happening here is James is basically saying, don't you see, what gets us off track when it comes to true wisdom is when there's selfish ambition and when there's envy inside of us. And so much of the world that we live in today, it's marked by envy and selfish ambition. Social media today, it's all about envy and what other people have and what other people want. And then we start thinking about other people and we start seeing like, oh my goodness, like, I can't believe they're always on vacation and they're always eating such good food. Why is that the case? Then you realize they preset all those pictures from whatever time ago, right? I mean, but this is what we do. We compare our mundane existence to everyone else's highlight reel. And so as a result, here we are and we're comparing, and mental health issues have gone skyrocketing. Why? Because of envy. And then selfish ambition begins to take place. This happens all the time, this envy and selfish ambition. I remember during the pandemic, and I recognize now, this is what I experienced in the pandemic. I realize that it may have been different for many of you all, but as a pastor of our community, like I was honestly so scared of what was happening. There were sirens going on, and I couldn't help, and I realized I couldn't help but think about myself, my family, and our church. And whenever I would think about our church, of course, I cared about how everyone else was doing. But honestly, I was caring about like, oh my goodness, people are going to leave our church. They're going to leave the city. How are we going to, financially, how are we going to make it? Are we going to have to support how are we going to support our staff? I mean, I was getting super nervous about all these dynamics. And then during that time though, I'm trying to grieve and trying to be a good pastor or whatever. And meanwhile, this whole wave started coming of what pastors and churches need to do is we need to go online. And we need to be online, and you need to be on Instagram and YouTube, and then sharing your services on these online platforms. And so I was like, okay, how do I do this? I don't get cameras. I don't know where to buy cameras or anything. So here I am now. All of a sudden, I'm just kind of okay, I've got to do something, but I'm not used to that. I'm not used to doing these online services and that sort of thing. And so as I'm wrestling with all of this, pastors started to circulate all these messages to each other, hey, here's a good camera to get. Hey, here's a good audio recording. Da 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 da. So I'm trying to learn all this material, and then of course here I am. As pastors are sharing all this information, I start I'm watching other people online, and I'm looking at these other churches in Manhattan and what they're doing online, and I was like, wow, why is our video so blurry compared to theirs? And why do the color, the lighting, it looks like they have this cool force field around them. Mine, why does it look like my face is in the dark all the time? And then all of a sudden, I'm watching these and I'm like, gosh, that pastor's a lot better looking than me. I'm just oh my goodness. So now all of a sudden, I'm so anxious about this that I start watching other online services, not only the ones in Manhattan, because initially I'm comparing myself to other churches in Manhattan. I'm like, oh my goodness, what's going on? That then all of a sudden, there's churches, I realized, I could watch services in Australia. And then so I'm watching these services in Australia, and I'm like, they're really good looking. Oh my goodness, I can't believe this. What am I doing? And then I'm just comparing myself, and all of a sudden, I would stay up late at night watching online church services. I know no one else was doing that. But here I was, and it was because I just wanted more of God during that time. I just wanted more. No, of course not. I was just let me see those, how do they do those cameras and everything, what's going on here? So here I am, like I'm comparing myself like crazy. And this envy starts to seep up. And then this ambition. And I realized that a lot of my mental health issues during that time was comparing myself to other online services of other churches. Now, one of the funny things is when we were talking to other pastors during that time, a couple years later, I would be talking to them and be like, hey, what happened during that time in online services? And most pastors know this, during that COVID season, like numbers spiked through the roof. It was like the most online engagement anywhere at any time. And so I remember talking to them, they were like, yeah, revival was breaking out online. And so I'd be talking to these pastors, I'm like, wow, revival was breaking out online. And I was like, hey, I don't know if it was revival. It was me watching your services thousands of times. Like, I'm sorry to break it to you. It was envy. It was envy in me. I know it's only pastors who wrestle with envy and selfish ambition. I'm sure in your fields, in finance or in law, whatever, like there's no selfish ambition and envy. But doesn't this happen all the time? Envy and selfish ambition, this gets at us all the time. And what ends up happening is instead of being grounded, right, with our feet to the ground, we're washed away by the waves of whatever might come into our paths. And so as a result, this is what envy and selfish ambition does. You know, what's crazy is that throughout the scriptures, from the book of Genesis onward, whenever sin, and like the scriptures are 66 books written over 1,500 years. But whenever sin enters the story, for instance, in the book of Genesis, envy, the central temptation is like, God said that if you eat this, you'll be, what? That you're not allowed to eat it. It's because he knows that if you eat it, you'll be like him. Oh, there's envy. There's that selfish ambition. And then what happens is when sin enters the world and the world becomes unraveled, what ends up happening? Envy, strife, getting over on other people, exploiting other people. This oftentimes becomes part of the story in which we live. In 1 John chapter 2, it says the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. When it comes down to it, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, all of these things are basically envy and selfish ambition. But do you see what James is saying? He's saying, but wisdom is not based on these things. Instead, it's humility. It's having your feet on the ground. It's being rooted, not overestimating yourself, but not underestimating yourself and debasing yourself. But what happens is envy, it gets into all of us. Selfish ambition. I mean, even as a parent, I remember when David, as he was growing a little bit older, I'd see this other baby or toddler that looked like the same age. And I'm like, oh, the kid's already walking. So then I'd go over to the parents and be like, hey, oh yeah, your kid is so cute. Like, hey, look at my kid. But how old's your kid? Oh, it's about 11 months. And I'm like, oh, 11 months? David's 12 months. This is what I would tell myself, and I'd be like, okay, all right. Oh, you see, your kid's already walking. That's amazing. Praise God. Right? And then all of a sudden, I'd take David home. I'd be like, hey, buddy, you got to stand. Come on, walk. I'm just like, stay away. I mean, this happens all the time. And then all of a sudden, he's in elementary school. Yeah, your kid's really good at math. What's going on? Like, well, yeah, I don't know. It's just natural. But also, we send our kid to Russian math. Russian math? Russian. Oh, that's so funny. Russian math. Wow, of course. Yeah, Russian math. Go home and I'm like researching Russian math. How early can they start? I mean, this happens all the time. Like we live in a world that's built on this inordinate envy and selfish ambition. And how can we have a holy ambition? How can we be a people who are driven, but not shaped by envy and selfish ambition, but something altogether different? Notice what James writes. Look at what he says. The wisdom that comes from heaven is, first of all, it's pure. Then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. Now, isn't this so fascinating? Juxtaposed against the ways of the world, which is so shaped by envy, selfish ambition, he uses the word peace often. This word peace is a word for contentment and tranquility. Now, isn't that interesting? Of shalom. Now, here's what's so different is that he's saying that this wisdom, don't you see what happens to envy and selfish ambition is when that begins part of the mental calculus by which I make decisions in my relationships, when that becomes the things that drive me when it comes to my workplace, when it comes to the ways that I treat my kids and others around me, like what ends up happening is we become washed away by all sorts of worldly ambitions and selfishness. And yet, here's what he's saying. He's saying, like, see, but the peace, there's a wisdom that comes from heaven. And this wisdom is actually marked by a peace, a rootedness, a humility, a standing on the ground. A peace that the Apostle Paul would later call a peace that transcends understanding. Now, you don't even have to be a Christian here to know and be like, I want that kind of peace. I mean, isn't that the peace all of us want? Because most of us, we're so used to, based on my performance, based on what I do, based on how people perceive me. Like, we tend to vacillate in how we view ourselves and we view the world based on all of the whims of the world. But could you imagine having this kind of peace? A kind of wisdom that is so marked by this unmoved, on the ground, being able to discern and make decisions that don't come from envy and selfish ambition, but instead comes from a rootedness. Look at what James says about how do we receive this peace. Here's what's so astounding. He says, but if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven. He uses this language of coming down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. But notice he uses the language of coming from heaven again. Look what it says. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Coming from heaven. The word that's used is this word anathen. Can I hear you say anathen? It's this word that means from heaven. Now, here's where it's distinctly Christian now. Because for the most part, you must have been like, yeah, I think that wisdom, that's right, living out of envy and selfish ambition, that's not what life is about. But wisdom that's peaceful, that's pure, that's grounded. Like most of us can be like, yep, I agree with that. But now here's what James is saying. See, this wisdom, it's a wisdom that comes from heaven. Now, does that mean that there's wisdom, I can't work or achieve my own wisdom? No, I mean, he wrote this whole book, this whole letter. This whole letter is full of wisdom principles in which he's trying to encourage us how to live a wise life. However, he says that fundamentally, when it comes to what true wisdom looks like, it actually comes from heaven. In other words, wisdom is received, it's not achieved. Now, here's the thing. If it comes from heaven, then here's what it means for each one of us. Now, it doesn't matter how smart you are, how accomplished you are, what school you went to, how many degrees are behind your name. That doesn't matter how much your net worth is. All of that stuff, that's not what matters. See, true wisdom is being someone who's grounded enough to say, I need God's help. I need wisdom from above. When it comes to navigating my relationships, when it comes to navigating my future, when it comes to navigating my work, when it comes to navigating my shame or addiction, when it comes to navigating my life, I need help from above. Now, here's the thing. Some of you are like, no, as New Yorkers, we can do this on our own, by our own self-will. See, but don't you see, like, when you can have this kind of wisdom from God, like, it not only makes you humble, it also allows us to be secure. We're not changed by what other people think or our performance, but instead, we're so centered in a wisdom from above. Now, James actually uses this phrase, anathen, in another part of his book. Look what he says about from above. Look at what he says. He says, every good and perfect gift is from above, anathen, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth. See, James, remember, he writes this in light of having witnessed who Jesus is. And when he's talking about what true wisdom looks like, he basically says, don't you see, true wisdom comes from the Father of heavenly lights, the one who's the author of all truth, the one who doesn't shift. Like each one of us, our moods, they shift all the time, don't they? Our friend groups, sometimes they shift all the time. They go up and down based on the whims of what's happening around us. But could you imagine? But James, what James is saying is, there's a Father of heavenly lights in heaven above. He gives good gifts to his children. And if we can be a people who can find our greatest wisdom and peace and truth in God, it can change everything. Now, James, who knows, he's witnessed this in the life of Jesus, he knows that the personification of truth and wisdom is Jesus, who Jesus himself would say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Isn't it true? We all want this kind of peace. We all want this kind of wisdom. Well, here's what it takes. It takes receiving it from this Jesus and saying, Jesus, I want to entrust my life to you. Instead of trusting my career, instead of trusting even my friend groups. Again, nothing against friend groups and community. I hope you have wonderful friends in community. But I don't want to trust myself. I trust you, the one who does not shift like shadows, but the one who, from the heavenly lights, I can turn to you. I can trust that you love me, that you are for me, and that, Jesus, that you are the way, the truth, and the life, and that you died for me so that I could be made whole. Will you say, God, I trust from heaven above. Please give me this wisdom.